And we hope that someday you might get to Australia too. It's a very friendly country, and invariably I talk to people who've come back from there, and they're rather impressed by their visit and the friendship that is involved. We actually have an Australian living next door to us at WEFT, who's a veterinarian, and she comes from Perth and her husband comes from Hong Kong. So we're sort of looking around the world. One of the first questions I get always is, why did you come here and why did you stay here? So I thought I'd try and get that one out of the way first, and perhaps give you a little bit of background as to why I might be so involved, especially with Prairie. I came firstly because I had graduated in agricultural science and have a diploma of education, and I've been teaching, and I grew up with parents that had a strong visual part to their life, and so I wanted to bring that sort of background to you, and I wanted to come here for just basic experience. The US is a very rich country in terms of soils and rainfall, mid-latitude temperatures, and people coming from all over the world. So it's very unique, and so an interesting place to visit. Travel does gives us a life experience, and so that was a main reason for coming. A secondary reason was that I had been teaching and realized that didactic teaching often leaves out a lot of the audio-visual side of things. So I had a concern about investigating that, and at the same time getting an academic degree, high degree perhaps. I was thinking of a master's degree and going on to England and Europe, England especially, where my relatives are from, and but I ended up getting a master's degree in education. I started a PhD. It was not quite what I was looking for, because I wanted to combine art, education and science, and especially the biological aspects of science, and that was a little more broad than most PhD programs were wanting to be involved in. If I was in education, I would have had to follow an educator or a theory or something like that. And in this case, my involvement was somewhat more applied, a little bit like what you encounter with computer science, where there's a lot of input from a lot of directions, and we're working with that now. And to put that sort of information up into the sky with David's help is kind of exciting and interesting, and we're experimenting with it at this very time. So some of this will go up on YouTube with a few pictures of the mountains that I grew up with. So looking at Australia generally, it's a very unique country. It does not have the soils and water wealth that the US has. It's a very dry country. The winds that blow across from the Indian Ocean are carried right across the continent. They even carry salt from the Indian Ocean to the east coast of Australia. So the soils are fairly high in salt content. They're dry, which means that they are not fairly leached like a lot of soils are. So they don't have a lot of sort of what we call podsilization, the movement of clay minerals through the soil, so that you get a sandy layer and a heavier clay layer and then underpinning. These soils are derived mostly from sedimentary soils that have been under the ocean for quite some time, and they have all the current bedding and the indications of how they were when they were being formed under the sea. But it also means that they're very leached. This is not volcanic material coming up from the center of the earth as new magma that will break down to very rich soils. There is a range along the east coast of Australia where one plate, world plate, Gondwana land is this plate, that comes up and over another plate. And those plates are moving around the world slowly. So this ridge has risen up. It's not more than 2,000 or 3,000 feet in most places. In one place, Mount Kosciuszko, it goes up to 7,000 to 9,000 feet. Is the highest. So you do get some snow in that sort of situation, but it's mainly the ridge that allows the clouds to rise up and cool and drop water. So on the edge of that north-south ridge called the Great Divide, sometimes you can get 80 inches of rain. But if 80 inches of rain falls on porous limestone and slippery shale, the water either runs off or it gets absorbed and runs through the layers of rock. When that tectonics moves the earth, then sometimes there's a fissure and a volcano will come through. So dotted along that whole corridor from Melbourne to Sydney to Brisbane to further north, there are outliers of volcanic material, and they're very easy to recognize because when you drive up to them, the volcanic soil is called an edaphic soil. That means that the vegetation on it is dependent on the style of the soil, and you'll have a tropical rainforest there, surrounded by very wizened, dry, tremendously interesting native vegetation that can live without water. So you have this little enclave. It might be called Mount Tomar or Mount Bell or what have you, just a little volcanic piece in there. Let me tell you where my people came from to that sort of situation. My mother is Cockney in background. That means she lives within the sound of Bow Bells. If you sing old rhymes, then if you're in the sound of Bow Bells, you're a Cockney, and you have little sayings that are quite peculiar to that enclave of people in London, in a suburban London. It's much more guttural in its style. If you're speaking, you got a bread is how it's represented. It goes with a lot of sayings, like if you're playing cards, you will always rhyme. You'll drop your card and there'll be I don't know whether you call it a limerick but there's some saying to go with it. There's a dress code where people will dress in an outrageous manner, and they'll speak at the Domain or someplace where they can put down a soapbox and stand on it and speak very independent. My mother's family were tailors and artists, and my grandfather was a tailor of note. If you were on Savile Row, you had to be a tailor of note, and so that's where the tailors of sophistication hung out. He had 3 daughters. That was my grandmother's side of the family that were more the artists, and artists that were hung in galleries at the right height for viewing, which means that you have a respectability. My mother went to the Palace School, and one of the things she remembered most was that the stairwells, the stone stairwells, had been used for centuries, and they were worn down. So you had to be careful walking up the stairs to old buildings. Both of my parents were born at the turn of the century when Queen Victoria was still around, and the sun was still never setting on the colonies. The British Empire had so many colonies out there that the sun never set on them. And England provided the human resources to person those colonies, mostly man those colonies. And that went back to, in Australia, it went back to the 1770s, and the movement involved some change from after the War of Independence. No longer could Britain send its convicts to the US, so some of them at least went to Australia. So there the speech pattern is quite different. It's from inner England, inner Manchester or London or Newcastle, and it's much more a squawky voice, a Dad and Dave and Mabel sort of sound, a squash voice. You hear it sometimes if you're in Boston, where there has a convict background. You'll hear that, and it was also augmented some by Irish and the Celtic background. One of the things that is impressive behind all this is that at a certain stage, people with sophistication and qualifications and money at the time, it became fashionable for people to have estates. And if you didn't have a castle, you built yourself a castle. You built yourself a ruin. It's got a name. I think it's like, it starts with F, and I forget its name, but this was a simulation of a broken down castle. But it took over farmland that was used by peasants, and those peasants moved into cities, and they starved and had a really rough time, and then they would thieve and do violent things and get themselves into prisons, which were not very friendly prisons. Sometimes they were burned at the stake, sometimes they were, I'm not sure whether they were beheaded, but the treatment was pretty bad. You were very lucky if you got a sentence of being sent to the colonies. So those convicts that landed in Australia shortly after it was discovered by Cook and others, not that it wasn't discovered by Aboriginals long before that, but those were people from basically administrated by military people who were from a lower income bracket and not awfully sophisticated, and also by convicts, some of whom were sophisticated. If you were a highway robber in London and you'd been robbing coaches, you might just have a degree of sophistication that meant that you would be able to administer the colony at some stage. So after a while, convicts got to be administering early colonies. And you had some conflicts there. The early settlers in Australia got to be almost welcomed by Aboriginals at one stage, till the Aboriginals started to die of European type diseases that they had no immunity to. And they also realized that their lands were being taken over, so whereas they were prepared to share at the outset in a very communistic way of sharing with everyone else, that they backed off of that and became somewhat opposed to the settlements. But their numbers decreased very rapidly, the same way as happened with Indians in this country. So my mother's father decided to move to Australia as a colonialist, and it was just before World War II and World War I, sorry, and then the war happened. But by the time they got away, they were having to dodge U-boats that were freshly designed by Germany to cause havoc to shipping lanes. So they, my mother was the eldest daughter. She was 13, and they went down the west coast of Africa, past Cape of Good Hope, and then you hit a bunch of winds which include names like the Roaring Forties, and you sort of moved across under the Bight of Australia and to settle in Sydney. By the time my parents were there, Sydney was very much settled, and so they took a small house in Bondi, which is a beach area on the east of Sydney, and popularised as a surfing capital of Australia to some extent. It's Sydney Harbour is what is called an estuary. It's where water melting in different glacial areas drowned what was a waterway. And so you have sometimes islands, sometimes water moving around, harbours that are fairly deep and not unlike what you get in Maine, where some similar drowning of estuaries has happened. Port Jackson was much preferred to another port which is called forgetting the name of it, but it's a bay a little further south of Sydney. So early settlement was there, but it's moved to Sydney Cove or Port Jackson. My mother was an artist and also a seamstress and a designer. She worked with her father, but father came from a kind of sophisticated background where coattails and top hat were in vogue. But the run-of-the-mill Australian citizen, going back to the term Pommy, prisoner of Merry England, they're kind of a rougher, tougher Australian, and those Australians would give people like my grandfather a very hard time. So it took him a long time to get work in Australia and to develop his tailoring service. In the meantime, they lived virtually on shot wheat, which is germinated wheat, which you can make porridge out of, and my mother would go off to the markets and they would buy second-hand fruit, the pockmarked fruit and vegetables that they could use for a fairly low price. And two other sisters, one became a school teacher, Cicely, and one became a matron of a flying doctor base in Western Australia. they both married, all three married. My mother married my father, who has a background that is not unlike the immigration background. We don't know about it. We don't think we're convicts in background, but we may be on one side of the family. People don't know. In fact, it gets to be very prestigious these days if you can follow back your history to find out that you were actually a convict. That makes you a real Australian in a way, so it becomes prestigious, but not many people can do that because there aren't very many records. But my father's mother's family were Carrs, and they came from England. Part of the family went to Salt Lake City, Utah, and became Latter-day Saints or Mormons. And we met up with them in later years because Mormon people are missionaries, and they had gone to Australia. There was California and other places on the west were having gold rush eras, and then the same sort of gold rush occurred in Australia. So Ballarat and Bendigo and places like that were gold mining towns, and they were kind of raunchy. So missionaries were there to see that people didn't knife or shoot each other, or they would try to control prostitution houses and things like that. So the family, Carr family, had been in Australia, came back to, one of the missionaries married an Australian and came back to Utah, and there was a fairly pious member of the church. And then the wife passed on, and the husband married a nurse who was somewhat more rambunctious in style, so that when I go to Utah, I meet up with two families, and one, it's no longer a case of polygamy, but my cousin there, in inverted commas because we're in different eras, bought a house from a gentleman that had two wives, and one family had an ice cream factory and one family had a pie factory. And strangely, this is on a hill in Utah where some of the streets are named with Australian-like names, like Fern Street is reminiscent of the inner suburbs of Sydney, which are Redfern, where my father actually grew up. So one side of the family has a route that we know about, and the other side we don't know so much. These were big families. At the turn of the century, we're still trying to have enough families that the family could support each other. So my father was the Ernest Septimus, Septimus being the seventh son, and he was also the 14th child. So people can't imagine such large families now, and it would be tremendously difficult to give modern day children the sort of benefits that you need, the planes, the computers, the things that weren't necessary or weren't available at the turn of the century. My father engaged in a lot of work-type situations. He worked with glass and carpentry and sold other goods, and he eventually, churches were big time. You went to school sometimes at church, you did gymnastics at church. It's a little bit like the history of the YMCA or the YWCA. The churches were providing service opportunities for people as well as metaphysical opportunities. My father studied at a congregational college and was appointed to a congregational church. The congregationals in Australia and other places are pretty well known for being heretics. They are free thinkers. They're a little bit like the Unitarians, that sometimes will combine with the Holy Rollers or Unitarian Universalists. Sort of implies a group of people that are quite different but kind of friendly and compatible. So my father and my mother both were Congregationalists, and that perhaps has some influence on what I do and what I think. My father was a minister in charge of a church for about 5 years. That's where he met my mother, and my mother was at that stage not sure about what she was doing, so she went off to be a nanny at a ranch or a station at Moree, which is up on the in the boondocks of New South Wales, and where she was the teacher for the 3-person family, 3 children, and they would get some of their education from Blackfriars School via radio. You had a little bicycle and you generated enough electricity to get your lessons at a certain time of the day, and my mother was the teacher that worked with that sort of thing. After a while she came back and my mother and father married, and my father pulled out of the church because he felt he wasn't as godly as his congregation. My father's style was to be rather pragmatic about preaching. I can remember him leaning over the pulpit with pictures of Mr. Grumpy and Mr. Sad, who turned upside down. It would be different. Or using plumb bobs. So my father went to school teaching because he felt he could do some of the same sorts of things without having to be too involved with godliness. When he was finished with his studies, which the church college approved of, because being heretics, they like to engage in thoughtful things, and my father was indicating that he was thinking about what he was doing and teaching. So he went off teaching with the blessing of the principal of the college, who was an MA from Oxford and had a certain degree of experience and sophistication. When you're appointed to a school in Australia, the state appoints you, and so by this time my father was a little older in style, and so the first appointment you get is usually to the boondocks. So his appointment was to a small retired copper village which had broken down, and there were no longer enough copper to warrant using. It may have been open these days, I don't know. But it was in the northwest corner of or it's called the plains, the slopes of sloping back from this mountain, this tectonic plate. It's surrounded by stations. Stations are big expanses where you have a few cattle per acre because the soils aren't good enough to take a lot of stocking. If you overstock, you ruin your native plants that you feed on, and then you have a barren place. So you have to be careful to have a lot of acreage and yards. So I grew up in a little school with a house residence next door. Those places had horse paddocks, usually large horse paddocks, because a paddock being a field. the horse paddock was used by people who rode to school on horseback, and that was where the horses stayed while the child was at school. By the time my father got there, they weren't using horses quite so much, but there was still only one car in the community. There was a difference between the people who had stations and the people who were derivatives from the copper era that ran the post office and the store. And when I was born, my mother went off to Bondi, where her people were, before people noticed that I was about to arrive. And she arrived back in town with baby, and that, for the gossip mill, was kind of strange. How they handled the situation was that if all was well, my mother sent a telegram to say, "A lawnmower at Anthony Horton's, will I buy?" That meant that the baby had arrived and all was well. So I arrived in surprise to some extent. But when you're a school teacher in small communities like that, you also run the voting booth, you're a community system, community leader. So part of the, I have to assume it was part of the horse paddock that was used for a field, but that I was below the age of 3, and I can remember my father cutting oats with a scythe and cutting little roads through the oat field so that I could run around and enjoy myself. We had a pet kangaroo, and the pet kangaroo was given to my parents because when you hunt kangaroos, and there's a tendency to hunt kangaroos because they eat a lot of your vegetation and compete with sheep. So sometimes if you are driving in the boondocks, you might encounter 60 kangaroos lying down on the vegetation, and when they're actively eating, that's a lot of kangaroo. So sometimes kangaroos are hunted, and when they hunt the mother with a joey in its pouch, the mother scrapes the joey out and throws it into a bush with the hope that the joey will survive, even if she does not. So one of these joeys was picked up by hunters that know that this is what happens. And this little creature became very protective of my family. Not the sort of thing you should have for a school teacher, because school teachers are those leaders and people have to come and visit them. The kangaroo would tend to put people under the fence. So, but the kangaroo eventually died, but it was a very neat little animal. It would always go to the toilet in the same place and would eat oats and things like that, and was very much bonded pet. When they get bigger, they can be very big animals, and they can revert to the wildness that is their nature. So you have to be careful about keeping an animal like that. Kangaroo. You can play with them, work with them, love them. When the mating season comes on, they like to box, but they can also stand on their heavy tail and rip your guts out with their their back feet. And that often happens to a dog that follows a kangaroo. When a kangaroo gets hold of the dog, it will destroy the dog in no time. So you just can't have kangaroos around without you know their propensities for doing things. I had one person that I knew used to be always playing leapfrog with kangaroos. He'd bend down, the kangaroo would go over the top, he'd go over the top of the kangaroo. And you can have that sort of relationship, but it's still a wild animal. When my father went to Gulf Creek, there was one car, so he bought a car. He bought a whippet, a Turo whippet. So 1928 tour with it. And, I can remember that car. I can remember going down over the Gulf Creek and across a ford and up the other side, and I can remember a rag sitting on a root that had been exposed by making a cutting. And we would go to a ranch and see the cattle being corralled and treated for disease if necessary. And so I have some memories. But the area was visited by a fruit and vegetable vendor from the coast, and Charlie Penny would come with a truck. I'm not sure, but I would guess it probably at that era still had solid tires, and would have an open cab, and it might be a Federal, which is probably also coming from the US. Charlie Penny decided that their school on the other side of this mountain range, down in the flat, it would be a good place for any monk to apply for a job. So my father applied for that and got the job, and we had to move. We had to move from the plains, the black soil plains, and we moved with the aid of a wool lorry, a lorry being a truck, a flatbed truck that you put bales of wool on. At that time, Australia was actually living on the back of the sheep. You didn't have plastics, you had wool. And more recently, the wool trade has lost out because wool is a natural fiber, and it also attracts all sorts of insects, and it's not as flexible as plastic, so plastic has taken over. But Australia is still dependent on wool, but in those days it was a lot dependent on wool. And so you had big trucks. Unfortunately, when it rains, the black soil plains are very greasy. They got bogged with all the monk furniture. We didn't bring the cow. That found another home, but we did bring chickens, and so the chickens were fed bananas for several days until they got their truck out of the bog, and then across to the top of the range where I've talked about there being forested areas, rainforest, because Dorrigo, just 7 miles up the hill from our little community that we went to. It was all rainforest. Very good wood there, and the atrocious way of how it was harvested was to cut a gap in 10 or 20 trees and hope that the next windstorm would fall acres and acres of forest that you could then go in and pick out the trees you wanted. But it decimated the forests that were on this black or red soil derived from volcanic activity. And that meant that the plateau of Dorrigo was cold and windy, and the birds had gone because there were no trees left. So then they started planting windbreaks that were to protect them from the wind. The wood, the lumber like coach wood, went to making coaches and to making ships and things like that. So that road from the top of the Dorrigo Mountain down the escarpment was 7 miles of steep curves and sharp curves, and steep grades, and you kept your horn blowing all the time, just because if you rounded the bend you might be fronting up with another vehicle coming up. So we got to Thora. Thora was an interesting place. It's on the Bellinger River. The escarpment has a river running in front of it, usually taking in a sort of a palmate way, the same way as moraines give forth rivers here, and the river runs in front of the moraine. So the Hawkesbury River, the Pin which runs into the Hawkesbury, ran along the front of the escarpment near Sydney. Further up the coast, about 300 miles, the Bellinger River did just that same thing. And we had a bridge, but invariably when 80 inches of rain came, you had a flood, so we would have the school and its residents. Sometimes we would have up to 30 people trapped, not able to get across the bridge. These days they have a high bridge that avoids the flood. If you're knowledgeable about quick floods, you know that you either have a very low ford or a low bridge that most of the rubbish and moving rocks and things that can move over, or you have a high bridge which is too high to catch the lumber and stuff that's coming down the stream. My father would have to let children out of school immediately it rained, just in case they couldn't get home across the streams that would come up very quickly. So very fast flowing streams going out to the Pacific Ocean and joining the Bellinger River, which is named after a nabob of the British background. I forget what the designation would be, but it might be a Duke or Earl or someone like that, but someone who was going to give a name to this community. My mother would teach sewing and things like that, and then she had 3 children to bring up. My father would teach in one teacher's school. Sometimes it had 45 students, sometimes it had 25, depending on what was going on. If you had road development in the area, you might have more children. It was a mixed dairying area with mixed agriculture, so you milked your cows, but you were too far from the city to provide milk. You had to convert that milk to cream, and the cream had to be transported to a butter factory where that butter was made, and the butter was salted and could be exported to the homeland, which was England. In our case, if you were in other colonies, you might be sending similar resources back to Belgium or France or Italy, or most of those European countries had colonies, and they were certainly using the resources that they got there. That was part of the reason for having people immigrant to be in charge of the whole show. The dairying meant that you milked the cows separated, so everyone had a separator. The separated milk went into troughs made out of trees that were fallen, and you'd hollow them out and put a board across the end. You let the skim milk sour, because fresh milk would really irrigate the pigs. You would, so you would let it mature some, a little bit like junket. And then you also had corn, beans, and truck crops. I remember harvesting peas by hand. So little streams and small farms on the alluvial floodplains that were the result of eroding material that did capture a little bit of the eroding basaltic soils on the hills. The outliers would mean that the alluvial floodplains were a little bit valuable. But then you had hills that were on the coastal plains, which were a little bit like the mountain itself, were not very rich, so you had to have a lot of acres and a few beef cattle. The dairy cattle were on the alluvium. We were 10 miles from the nearest town. The little village that we had a post office. It had a gas bowser. A gas bowser in its day is a gas pump where you pump the gasoline up into a reservoir so you can see whether you got 4 gallons, and then you let it out into the car by gravity. We didn't have electricity, and that was a gas pump, or in our colloquial term, it was petrol in a bowser. And he went to a garage. So there was a hall, there was a blacksmith, and the blacksmith had a huge bellows that he would shoe horses and Edgar Jordan. And Edgar was somewhat deaf because of the number of times he'd hit steel with steel and ruined his ears. And Edgar Jordan would talk to you in a loud voice, and he would ride home on his horse. It certainly has changed. My father was the teacher, and so I picked up from him. He was a recognized user of audiovisual aids. He had all sorts of gimmicks to teach children, and the school inspector that comes around to inspect to see that you're doing your job well would refer people to my father's retinue of materials. And I probably shouldn't use the term retinue, but it's father had a lot of things, and like father, like son. I had a lot of junky things next door that I move on to other people when I get the chance. And he would do likewise. He would buy second-hand lumber, and father taught carpentry because he'd grown up doing that. So if you want to know where my background came from, there was my artist mother and my father with teaching and metaphysical thoughts, as well as teaching and preaching thoughts. He continued to preach intermittently when people were out of town and needed some backup. My father would still preach, but he was basically a teacher. He went through the era of the recession in the early 30s, and he was paid for the whole time. And we had so many people around us that did not get paid, and so my father was very impressed to tell people to go into things like school teaching, because it was a more safe governmental job, apart from the fact that he was also a born teacher. So now we put those two people together, and we get myself, and I come here. And why do I come here? Yes, I would come here to have experience and to get some academic qualifications. And but one of my real scientific background interests is in biodiversity, and one of the things I was looking for was prairie. But in East Central Illinois, I really couldn't find prairie very well, and that shocked me because we need that sort of genetic pool to go on to other generations. So gradually I started to take 300 and 400 level courses and find out where the prairies were, and started to get involved, become somewhat of an obsession or a passion. And I didn't like people referring to me in that way initially, because I thought passion, that almost meant you were sick. But I gradually become to realize that for artists and people who are doing things that they really care about, the word passion means that they have a serious interest. It's not a direct derogatory word. I got involved, and so I taught at a high school. I went to an agricultural boarding school, and then I taught in an agricultural boarding school after I graduated, and then I taught in a college, and I felt the need for more than didactic teaching. I felt the need, like my father did, of having teaching aids and to have inserts of material that would go into an established curriculum without destroying the teacher's adherence to the curriculum, but giving a teacher some aids. And I was very glad when I came here. I got a master's degree in agricultural education and had access to curriculum materials of that nature that were very interesting. And I started to include those sorts of materials in and about prairies. So going back to Australia, we have 5 minutes left. I should say this is Dave Monk from Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And let me stop a moment to ask David if he has any comments to make. He often adds a thought, and he's been working with me enough to know some of the things that we get involved in.
Well, since you started out by saying that you tell people about your background come the holidays, I've been waiting for you to get around to the point where you tell us what the holidays were like. Now, both of your parents came from England, so they didn't have the rough and tumble background behind them, and yet here they are in this land that was quite different.
No, my father grew up in Australia.
I'm sorry.
Several generations before his progenitors were in Australia for many generations.
I got the impression you said the Savile Row was where he came from pretty directly. If
no,
not.
that was my mother's father.
Sorry, I missed that detail.
And she was, yes, she grew up in London. My father grew up in Sydney.
Oh, well, at any rate, so
in the inner suburbs of Sydney. So he was from Surrey Hills and Redfern, which were tight neighbourhoods with people who didn't have a lot of money.
As opposed to your mother, who came from a bit, maybe
well,
not gentrified.
no, she came from Cockney, inner London, which is kind of lower income London.
But her family may have, I got the impression you said that her family themselves were the Taylors.
Yes, it is a Taylor.
That's an interesting dichotomy.
It's interesting you asked the question, because grandfather was really not a Cockney. He was a Taylor from a different territory, and they lived in Cockney territory. But I suspect my grandmother, from her artist family, was also not from Cockney territory. So it's an interesting thought. But if you look at Christmas in Australia, it's going to be warm. It might be, if it's a very hot day, it might be 100 degrees. And the climate is very different, but my mother would still have the remnants of snow. So there are little pieces of cotton wool on windows and things like that, and Santa Claus dressed up like he's got a snow uniform. But more and more that's being avoided, and you're going to Australian pictures of eucalyptus trees and the Australian landscape for Christmas cards, for instance. So for Christmas, our house was on a hill, and so the back door was on the flat, but the front verandas were on pillars that were about 8 feet tall, so we could have carpentry benches and things that my father would teach with under the house. And on the veranda we would have a Christmas tree, which is usually a casuarina, which it hangs like a pine tree, but it's not a pine tree. We go down to the river and harvest a casuarina tree and bring it back for a Christmas tree. And we may have relatives come in by railroad. The railroad was about 30 miles away, and you got to have a service car. And most people didn't have a lot of transportation. They might have a car, like my father's 1928 Whippet, but many people are still using sulkies or riding horses, like the blacksmith would ride his horse home. The early ambulances looked like very creative affairs. We were in an area that was probably way behind the like of Sydney. So you had a couple of doctors, and you were lucky to have that. Perhaps Bellingen had 2,000 people. Christmas was a time when you went swimming, and you had to be, the myth, I found it as a myth, was that you shouldn't go swimming after eating a big meal, because you just might sink, because sometimes the rivers are cold coming from mountainous areas. But we would get in the rivers and sometimes you get two stones together and you bump them and you could move a sound under the water, and that would crackle somebody else. So, but it's got to be time. So I'm thinking of Australia and more what we do rather than just a specific Christmas. That we live very near to a rainforest, and we have wonderful birds that are like paradise birds with long tails and interesting calls, whipbirds and lyrebirds, and very, very unique vegetation. And my father had a little farm, and we had up to 10 cattle, and they were kind of pets. And we had vegetable gardens and orchards, and we were there for 13 years before the school was closed and decided, like here, to bus people to the central school. So I think this time it's David Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champagne, 90.1 on your FM dial.